When you think pasture, most people think grasses. But today we're going to introduce the idea of bringing trees into the landscape and into the pasture. It's all about silvopasture coming up. Welcome to Grassfed Life. I'm your host, Diego, D-I-E-G-O. Today's episode is brought to you by the Grassfed Life Insider. Are you an insider? Are you helping to support the production of free podcasts just like this? If you are, thank you. And if you aren't, consider becoming a Grassfed Life Insider for just $5 a month. The Grassfed Life Insider gets you access to exclusive content every week out of the year. That means you get access to an ever-growing and ever-expanding library that goes beyond what we talk about here on the podcast to help you on your farm. Learn more, check it out, and become an insider at grassfedlife.co. In today's episode, I'm talking to author and farmer Steve Gabriel. Steve's the author of the new book, Silvopasture, A Guide to Managing Grazing Animals, Forage, Crops, and Trees in a Temperate Farm Ecosystem. Steve's somebody who I've known for a while, and one thing I love about his approach to taking on these subjects is he does a lot of deep research, coming at it from both the academic side and the farmer side. So he practices what he preaches and he preaches what he practices. His book is a great place to start if you're interested in getting into silvopasture. And why might you want to get into silvopasture? That's one of the big topics that we'll cover in this one. So let's jump right into it. It's increasing farm resilience and grazing marginal land with silvopasture. So Steve, silvopasture might mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, and to some people it might mean nothing. What is silvopasture as you define it?
Yeah, so simply put, silvopasture is intentionally combining trees, livestock, and forages. And then the word intentional is really important, I think, to that, because there's a lot of silvopasture that might happen kind of haphazardly or sort of by chance, but we're talking about really thinking and designing and monitoring silvopastures, and really looking for the synergy so that those three parts all benefit, that none of them are hurt through the process. So what's really key with that is that we monitor them, and the hardest one to monitor is really the trees, because they grow slow, and sometimes it's hard to tell the effects, but certainly with the forages and the livestock and some good planning, we can do well.
When you look at silvopasture, you talk about it a lot in your book titled Silvopasture. What are some of the benefits of silvopasture over pure pasture? I think a lot of people listening to this, they're going to raise poultry, they're going to raise pigs, lamb, they're going to have cattle, and it's mostly done in a grass-based system. When you start looking at silvopasture versus pure pasture, where does silvopasture start to win?
You know, I list a ton of benefits in the book, but the ones that seem to float to the top as I talk to farmers and as we implement this on our farm more and more, I think that the two that strike me the most exciting are, the first is that, you know, here in the Northeast U.S. And in many other places, we're seeing with climate change, we're seeing increased extremes, and here that looks like increased frequency of drought and also increased frequency of heavy rains and flooding. And both those scenarios start to impact the grasslands. They're not as adaptive to those extremes, and so we see in those cases our pasture productivity really decrease. And trees and tree-based systems can help mitigate and buffer some of those effects. And I think that's a really important piece in severe drought years here. The trees actually look pretty much the same. And in severe flood years, they look pretty much the same. And in normal years, they look the same. And so they offer that stability. And I think what's, to me, most exciting about that is the trees themselves can actually be a source of food in these extreme conditions. So tree fodders, I think, are an exceptional benefit, and something that we're just starting to explore. It's something that's more common in traditional agriculture systems worldwide, but in North America is just starting to come to the table.
Thinking of that and the history of silvopasture in this country, where was it ever in the past? or was it ever not really established here? Why isn't more silvopasture out there, or is it out there? We're just not noticing it.
Well, I think we can consider the traditions of many of the indigenous cultures that stewarded these lands for thousands of years. Now, not most often with domestic livestock, most historically with wild game, but certainly in the use of fire and other techniques to maintain a certain forest type that was favorable for hunting, we could really extrapolate that and say that looked like silvopasture. Many of what is often thought of these kind of dense thickets of woods were actually not the way that most Native Americans were maintaining the landscape, at least in the East, and that kind of open forest that provided good feeding for grazing herbivores, large and small, were things that mimic what we might envision a silvopasture of today. And I think when European settler colonizers came over and started to shift the way that land was used, they brought with them a mentality, and it's really clear digging into the history that forest land was just viewed as having very low value, and so it really started a legacy of improved land or good land was cleared land, was land that was suitable for the plow. And so the practices that actually do have roots in Europe, in parts of Asia, in parts of Russia that really integrate trees and animals weren't really brought over with that settler colonization. It was really the plow that was the focus of agriculture. So we've had this legacy where we divide field and forest, and I talk to farmers all the time that can't imagine the thought of putting trees in their pasture, or can't imagine the thought of putting livestock in forested settings. But again, if we zoom out and look historically, I think that used to just be called farming. The fact that we have to name it silvopasture is kind of ironic, because in a big enough time scale, animals and trees have really coexisted for, I think, a much longer time than they have apart.
And let's look at two of those worries there that you just mentioned. Putting trees in your pasture. I mean, what are the common worries you hear around that, and why should a farmer not be worried about that, and why should they be excited about that?
Yeah, so I think the common things I hear and experience, because we've learned along the way, is the time frame it takes from planting that tree to essentially allowing the animals to interact with it. So, trees have to at least have 3 to 5 years where they're excluded from livestock impact, because they'll be killed. And depending on the species, then it might be longer before the animals can be reintegrated back into that. So if you start Googling like silvopasture images, there's all these nice images of a finished forest with animals grazing underneath. But that transition time is really hard, I think, for folks to envision and know how to manage for. What we focused on is really fast growing trees in the landscape, and then also with sort of the widely accessible fencing technology that we can employ now, which essentially is net fencing or polywire. We can fence out animals pretty inexpensively, and so that's, I think, opened the door because basically we can plant trees in pasture and keep the animals out with relatively low cost. So I think it's the farmers envisioning and understanding what that transition time looks like. And I think the other thing with putting trees in pasture is the concerns with sort of long-term equipment access and what that's really going to do to the forages on the understory. But research has really shown that bringing shade trees into these grazing systems actually has long-term some benefits, especially in the hotter, drier months or hotter, drier seasons, where the shade actually provides a better quality forage over the long term. And that's really the biggest benefit is you see with trees in pasture this modulating of the climate and the microclimate on the site. And so, over time, we've really started to see a shift in the way our grasses are responding, the way the system's responding, and the benefits to the animals. And the animals in these pastures are getting access to shade when they need it. Now, we're not talking about such a dense planting that no sun is cast. It's actually probably about 50% canopy would be our ideal if we were to get there. And that's not something that's going to happen immediately. It's going to happen over potentially even several decades of implementation. So I think the other thing to think about with silvopasture is lot of folks come to it interested in the carbon benefits, carbon sequestration benefits, and planting trees in pasture is really the approach that has incredibly high and incredibly rapid, depending on the tree species, carbon benefits to the site and to our larger globe. When we're clearing trees and removing vegetation in order to get animals in there, we're actually, at least in the short term, having a net carbon loss. So if folks are really interested in silvopasture from that carbon standpoint, then we really have to be talking about trees in the pasture. And I think it comes back to really good design, really thinking about the layout of our trees and a succession planting. We're not going to plant a full forest in every acre. It's going to be something that we do sporadically over time. Maybe every 5 years or 10 years, we add more trees. And we've been really thinking about ways to do that efficiently with fencing. So it's really about, I think, everyone envisioning and doing a bit of trial and error, but we certainly suggest some patterns in the book and some ways to approach that without a huge risk, I think, to the farmer.
So if we're doing some of that envisioning and we're looking ahead 50 years to, let's say, an established silvopasture system that was designed, is it going to look more like a savanna type system, or is this more hedgerows? You say 50% canopy cover, so I'm trying to envision what that looks like. Is it pasture dotted with trees throughout it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the vision that comes to a lot of people's heads. The challenge with that is when you have relatively evenly spaced trees that are sort of singularly isolated, it becomes a management challenge because you have to then protect each of those individual trees during that establishment, which is expensive and hard to work with. And so we've been really moving more in the direction of rows of trees, double rows, single rows, and more like you suggest of sort of hedgerows. And that's just because it's much easier to sort of fence out a cluster of trees. What we think about is, can we start with widely spaced rows? So our thinking is that, for instance, for smaller animals like sheep and goats, we might start with rows of trees 50, 60 feet apart. With cattle, maybe 80 to 100 feet apart. And then we let those trees grow up and we exclude them as they're getting established with our fencing. And then if we want to come in and have a denser planting, well, then we come in maybe 5 or 10 years later and we plant a row in between those established rows, because now those established rows can be back in with the animals. And then we use our fencing to exclude those new plantings of trees. And so we kind of successionally plant out, and over time we could achieve that denser canopy. But I think the rows, generally, I think there's reasons to not favor that strategy, but I think on a broad scale, it just allows the fencing to work well, and it allows us to get these trees in place. And the other thing is by planting rows, and we like to do really dense rows, like 3 to 5 feet spacing between our initial seedling trees. We're actually growing trees like the forest grows them. The woods doesn't grow a tree, in an isolated setting. It grows a bunch of seed together that encourages the young saplings to grow nice and straight and tall, and then it thins them out over time. So we try to plant dense and then know that we're going to thin as part of that establishment. And that's how we get really good quality trees, for the long term.
One of your other books you wrote is Forest Gardening. This is a topic you're really familiar on. One thing that I'm thinking of is if you're planting these strips of trees, these are an entity that's used to growing in a forest system, which is large, it's dense, it's thick. When you have just a strip of trees, I see farms with hedgerows back east. How are the trees affected by just be planting in these narrow strips? Is it a system that works for them long term, or are you going to run into issues with tree management given that you just have these linear lines of trees throughout a system?
Yeah, I think, the species that we're really favoring are the early successional tree species, which are mostly adapted to open, full sun conditions. They're the trees that, if we were to leave a field and not mow it or graze it, would be the first kind of back on the scene to establish that new forest. I think those ideas of the dense, thick forest are, in many cases, decades or centuries down the line when the forest has really established itself. And forest succession tends to start with fast-growing, sun-loving species, and then that paves the way for more of the shade-loving. So, yeah, absolutely. If you were to, take sugar maple or beech or some of those types of species that really prefer it. Chestnut, even to some degree, the American chestnut is more of a shade adaptive species. You might see some of the slower growth or some issues with having them out in open sun versus trees like black locust and poplar and even the hybrid chestnuts or the Chinese chestnuts, which are more open grown adaptive. Those tend to do well in open pasture, and at least initially we don't see that being a large issue in terms of maintaining or having kind of good growth long term. But there is that question, I think, in your assessment here of what's the long term strategy here? What does it look like? Are we maybe starting with sun loving species and then adding in some more shade tolerant species? These are the questions that I don't have answers to, and it's part of this kind of long, slow experiment that is silvopasture. We have enough information to get started. We can err on the side of including trees that are highly adaptive and resilient and tolerant of a wide range of conditions, and I think those are our best bets to get started. But hopefully the conversation evolves long term, and we can start to think about some of the nuances of how this might look after we have our silvopastures established for a while and are thinking about the next stage.
And given the amount of knowledge we have right now around this subject, what are some of the challenges that you think farmers would run into if they try and implement a silvopasture system on their farm?
Well, I think the establishment of trees is if we're coming from that angle is very site specific and site dependent. So the type of soil that we're working with, the type of browse pressure from outside, from in the Northeast, we're thinking a lot about deer pressure. So our farm has relatively low pressure, but other sites I've worked on, the deer pressure is so high that they really have to go to extra lengths to protect those initial trees. These kind of things can really affect the outcome and affect the speed of establishment, which can be encouraging or discouraging depending on how that goes. I think when we're starting from the other end, which is with existing woody land that we're trying to open up for better forage establishment, that end, I think with more mature woods, what people are surprised about often is how much you really have to thin that forest canopy in order to get enough light down into the understory to have good silvopasture. And so that's a challenge and obstacle to really understand the impact of that. And my recommendation really is that we start our silvopastures on the more marginal parts of our lands. So let's keep out of the healthiest forest. Let's keep out of the healthiest pasture. Let's use silvopasture in either the open lands that are not as high quality in terms of the forages, or in those kind of overgrown, scrubby, thicket hedgerows or thicket. We have acres and acres on our land that's really just overgrown and hard to even walk through. Those sites are in need of some kind of restoration or some kind of work, and those are ideal for silvopasture in my mind, because the risk is a little lower and the benefit, the reward to the farmer is much higher, because we went from having X amount of acres of grazing land to expanding about 20% of our grazing land just by looking at these kind of gnarly edges and starting to play with silvopasture in there. And these are areas that have been unfortunately, the previous land legacy is they've been, high graded. All the best trees have been removed, and it's been a dumping ground for the farm, where the farmer's just putting all their junk in the hedgerow, and so it's kind of a cleanup and a restoration effort. But these seem to be the best places, at least, to get started.
If you look at these marginal lands, in your experience, what are the best types of livestock species to be putting in these areas? I mean, it's not something you're going to put cattle in, I'm assuming, right away. Is it a pastured poultry you're trying to run through there? Is it pigs? Is it goats? How do you view starting with this marginalized land and advancing it and then pairing it to a species?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think when I work with farmers, I think there's sort of what fits the land best, what fits your markets best, because at the end of the day, if can't get a good market for your product or it's oversaturated, it's probably not the best thing to do. So wherever that intersection is, what's best for the land, what's best for the local market, and what meets your goals, what you like to work with, I think is key as well. The what we need to think about, I think, with animals is that each of them have their sort of pros and cons, and I think any of them can work in these landscapes. The question is at what scale we want to be working at what speed in terms of converting these lands into the sort of more ideal site. And so, I always say that I think the safest ones that we can start to really integrate into grazing systems, and because we can do some math and we can kind of figure out what their feed needs are, would be the ruminants. Because basically, if the right ruminant, anything that's green is potentially a food source. And so, these overgrown areas often have lots of woody vegetation that many of these animals will take to and eat. Now, on that spectrum, if we think about cattle, sheep, and goats, cattle tend to really prefer open grassland. They'll eat a little bit of woody vegetation if it's the right species. And goats are on the other end. They're mostly like woody stuff, and we'll supplement with some grass. And sheep are kind of somewhere in between. And even within that, on our farm, we've selected a breed of sheep that kind of acts more like goats. They seem to prefer woody vegetation just as much as the grasses and the forbs. That's the breed we have is Katahdins. And they've been phenomenal. They're kind of one of our top favorites for silvopasture. So, the type of animal and also the breed, I think, has a big effect. I think where pigs come in is if you really want to do that turning over of the soil and that renovating. They're not necessarily going to strip vegetation as much, but they can help root up things. And pigs are also great, as well as poultry, in systems where we might be establishing or looking to harvest the value of trees that put out mast, like fruit or nuts or something like that, because they can really help clean up these things at the end of the season and kind of reset a system and prevent and break some of those pest and disease cycles. But the key thing with pigs and poultry, of course, is that we need to think about high protein sources, and that's not often going to be 100%. There's very few examples of that coming 100% from the landscape. So we're usually talking about importing and bringing in feed or grain or some kind of waste product to supplement that. So, it kind of depends on the action, and we talk about this in the book of, what kind of work you're looking to put the animals, at tasks to complete, and also what works for the economic bottom line, because we can't just think about these systems in isolation from that, or else we can't really justify doing any of the work at all.
If somebody's thinking about establishing a silvopasture system, whether that's planting from scratch or thinning out, do you look at getting the system in rotation as maybe more important than optimizing the species in that rotation? I think a lot of the stuff I've heard in the past on like tree crop establishment with livestock is people are focusing on what you refer to as, like, mast, fruiting trees. And I'm starting to think, okay, well, maybe those are slower growing. They might not be optimum for the open sunlight like you're describing. Is it better to get establishment, get size, get mass there, so you have a system that is going to want to kind of self-regulate itself, and then go back in and add your masting trees, add your fruiting trees? Or do you want to incorporate these trees in from day one?
Well, I think all that comes back down to the level of management that the farmers want to engage with. So, we have a small orchard on our farm. We're mostly planting really rapidly, fast-growing tree species that aren't producing fruit or mast or some other high value crop. They're really just there for shade, shelter, and fodder for the animals. So things like black locust, poplars, willows, mulberry. Mulberry we could be harvesting a fruit yield from, and we'll eat some of those ourselves. But by and large, it's there for the animals, and we see enough benefit in having those in the silvopasture. They don't have to produce another crop. And the thing to think about is if you bring in apples or you bring in nut trees, you're adding a huge other layer of management, which you can get a benefit from. But when we do our sort of self-assessment of what time and energy we have, managing that tree layer intensively is not something that we've decided is a high priority. So the large swath of our landscape is not in those trees. We'll have little pockets of those, which we know are kind of double the amount of management. So I think it depends on what people are after. Now, I know, and I have folks around me that are really doing a lot with apples, a lot of cider making happening here in New York, and so they're really invested in. Their primary focus is on that tree crop layer, and the animals are actually supporting the understory. They're basically there to support the apple crop. And so their main focus is not on the livestock yield, but actually the tree fruit yield, and they're looking for ways to support that with the animals. So I think it's important which angle we're coming from. Are we tree crop producers that have animals as part of that, or are we livestock producers that want to incorporate trees, into our grazing systems?
Given that your approach to the tree species and the woody species in the system is shelter, there's some fodder value there. Based on your research, based on your experience, how much food calorie value do you think the species are getting out of these woody species? Is it supplemental, or is it more than supplemental? It can be significant, because I think for a lot of farmers, this is where the economics can start to make more sense. If I'm going to spend money planting trees, if I'm going to spend time putting these trees into the system, am I getting more than just shelter out of it?
So I think at this point, I will say I think it's supplemental, especially if we're converting existing lands. When we look at kind of dense and overgrown shrublands, we're getting some food value out of that, certainly. But the basis of our animals' diet is still the grasses and the forbs that we have in the system. And it is really hard if your entire landscape is that kind of woody vegetation. It's hard to start with lots of animals because you just don't have as much dry matter per acre available. I really think, though, that we could head in a direction where these fodder systems become probably not only significant parts of the diet, but really essential parts. Because again, we had this experience in 2016 on our farm where we had one of the driest years on record. We were grazing and just really refining our rotation grazing system. And we grazed our whole farm once around, and we got back to that first paddock. And it was supposed to, according to the grazing plan, have adequate forage to put those animals back in. And we were planning that second rotation around the farm. But because of the drought, there was literally nothing. It had barely grown since the last grazing event. And our animals at that point had, nothing to eat, essentially. And all the livestock growers around us were sort of panicked and trying to figure out what to do. And people were driving around and picking up hay, and that feed cost suddenly skyrocketed because there's no contingency plan for what happened. But what we did that year was we put our animals into these hedgerows, into these thickets. Because of their adaptive quality, they basically survived off those it was quite biblical. It was like 40 days just on that woody vegetation, and that was kind of an emergency thing that worked out for us. And our hanging weights, at the end of the year were no different than any other year. So they didn't lose weight, they didn't lose sustenance, and this was just off the random stuff that was out there. So I took that as a hard lesson, and the economics is really going to pay off in those really extreme years. And I hope by then there's going to be another drought year coming up sometime, and I hope by then we have a lot more intentional fodder established, because I think that's really when it hits economically. But I do think that also over time, if we establish more of these plantings, we're going to see that benefit. And that is a risk on the part of the farmer. We can't, it's hard to quantify. It's hard to look at it in quite the same way that we can calculate our forage value in our pastures. But I do see that potential. And I think these are great questions to continue to explore as a community.
For anybody who's grazing pasture, I think over time the goal is denser pasture, more native pasture, more diverse species. When you look at the evolution of a woody system within silvopasture, how should that evolve?
I find it really helpful to take the dozens or hundreds of different tree species that we could possibly incorporate and sort of filter them through some criteria to think about what's most appropriate, especially for silvopasture. So when I was researching for the book, I really looked for some species that had some research as a valuable food source for animals. I looked at species that were, highly adaptable, that that wanted to live or existed naturally, natively in many different types of ecosystems, many different elevations and ecosystem types. I was really interested also in trees that were fast growing, as well as trees that were easy to propagate. So yeah, on our farm, we found really quickly that focusing on species that we could propagate cheaply on farm was really important if we really wanted to plant out, hundreds of trees a year, just because of the cost of doing that. So I guess, when we took a number of possible trees and kind of pushed them through all these different criteria, there were really four that became clear as at least a good starting point. And I'm happy to share more about those four species if that's of interest to you.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely something people are going to be really interested in. Keeping in mind that you're recording this in upstate New York, so I guess talk about the geographic specificity of these trees, as you go through them.
Yeah, one of the I think pieces of good news is that one of the filters when I think about adaptability was sort of geographically as well. So these are trees that we find in many different ecotypes all over the world. So they give that kind of opportunity, I think, to a lot of folks. So what I thought was really cool is kind of when I dug in and then kind of stepped back is that these four species kind of mimic the pasture species that we want. So if we think about, the main force of an animal's diet that's a grazing animal is our grasses, providing kind of a balanced nutritional opportunity for animals. Willows and poplars kind of fit that role from the tree fodder perspective. And the big difference is that willows have varying amounts of condensed tannins in their leafy forage, which turns out to be really beneficial to grazing animals. Those condensed tannins do two amazing things. One is they can help with parasite issues in the rumen of these animals. So, with our sheep, we're always concerned about them picking up and having parasite cycles that are really hard to break once they're here. So those condensed tannins help break those cycles and actually create inhospitable environments for those parasites to grow and reproduce. And the second thing with condensed tannins is they actually slow down the rumen and actually reduce methane emissions from our grazing animals, which is pretty awesome. And one of the critiques of grazing systems from a climate perspective is that they have been researched, and some research suggests they emit a higher amount of methane than like a confinement system. So condensed tannins seem to be a really important part of animals' diet. So the flip side of that is that the condensed tannins in willow will also limit the amount of the forage that the animals are taking in. So that's where poplar comes in. They can basically eat poplar all day and have kind of that grass analog. In poplars and willows, of course, we can get pretty impressive hybrid varieties that grow immensely fast, put on lots of biomass, and that's where we could get back to that earlier conversation about really providing a substantial volume in terms of an animal's diet. So we think about grass as being ideally like 70-80% of our grazing animals' diet. So then the other pieces that fill in the gaps are high protein forages. So often in pasture, we're thinking about clovers and alfalfa and these kind of legumes that can fix nitrogen and therefore in their vegetation have lots of protein. For at least the cool temperate climate, in many climates, black locust is essentially the analog for those species in the tree world. Rapidly growing, nitrogen fixing, really high proteins, essentially nutritionally very similar to alfalfa. And so very easy and great potential for use in a tree fodder system to kind of fill that role. And then, what we're missing is the forbs, which are the flowering plants and the non-grasses and the non-legume plants that are really high in minerals. And that's where mulberry comes in. And again, mulberry is a tree that's found in many, many climates, many different types of ecotypes worldwide, and has incredibly high mineral content, is actually very high in digestibility, both the berries, but specifically a lot of the research has been done on the leaf. Leaf meal, and in China, they're often actually harvesting leaves and making them into pelletized food, and they're feeding pigs, poultry, rabbits, all sorts of livestock off of that highly nutrient-rich material. So, the four of these species together, and if you're in a different climate, you could kind of swap them out. So black locust, if that's not appropriate, maybe mesquite in a drier climate is the appropriate analog, where it's a nitrogen fixing shrub that has some of those similar qualities. Poplar is really, also known as aspen, or cottonwoods are in that family. And so when we look at that, those grow in the driest, lowest parts of the world. They also grow in the high, mountainous parts where no other leafy trees are. You find aspen trees. So I think there's great potential for folks wherever they are to think about these species, at least as a starting point for if they're interested in that tree fodder value.
When you think about some of these species, little locusts grow up to be big locusts. Mulberries, they grow up to be bigger trees. Eventually, some of these trees are going to be extremely woody at the bottom. Branches are going to grow out of reach. Are you then just relying on new growth to supplement fodder if we're only looking at these bigger tree species? So a black locust drops seed, new black locust trees sprout up. That's what the animals are eating?
I'd say not so much. I think if you're really interested in tree fodder, you're actually going to be looking into management systems to keep vegetation young and accessible. What we think about is we're planting often densely. And so we're going to let some of those trees grow up to be what's known as standards, which are the high canopy trees that provide good shade and shelter. But then some of the other ones we might start to manage as a coppice or a pollard and start to really manage for tree fodder. And so there's kind of a balance point between wanting that tree trunk to get big enough so that the animals can't damage it, so the tree can continue to grow, and then thinking about ways to efficiently, harvest and make the food available to animals. And in New Zealand, which is one of the places we look to globally as really excelling in sort of pasture and grass-fed livestock management, they've been advocating for willow and poplar for these purposes for a long time. And so there's good examples of ways to kind of manage. And I think pollarding is the common one. Pollarding is where we cut the vegetation basically above browse height. So the animals aren't going to continuously kill off the tips of that growth, but we can then have food available that's relatively easy to harvest. So it might be easy for me to reach up and prune off some branches for these animals, from those trees. And of course they continue to grow. And there's some pollards that are going and they're, 40, 50, 60 years old that are still producing really high quality food. So I think it's a balance point. And again, we might let some of those trees grow taller and we're not going to use those for fodder. We're going to harvest, so to speak, the shade from those trees, but not use them as a food source.
Is maybe a pasture analog to that, where you'll hear somebody like Darren Doherty, Joel Salatin, they'll talk about keeping pasture species kind of in that teenage range where it just wants to grow. When it starts to get too tall, too old, it's unpalatable. It's not getting as much regrowth. So you're managing your grazing to keep the grass at that stage. Could you look at a silvopasture system, a woody system, the same way? Like you're really managing for that high vigor, high growth stage, and you're not letting the woody species outside of the select few that you talked about really get to that older age? Or larger, I guess. They're all getting older, but the larger stage?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's that's a good kind of pattern analogy, but I think the specifics are different. I know that from my experience, we cannot graze trees at the same intensity that we might be able to hit a same pasture. If we let it rest, with rotational grazing, we can let it rest and we can probably hit that same spot 3 or 4 times in a season. I don't think we can do that with trees. I think we can at best do 1 or 2 times. And one of the questions is that the nutritional quality of that leaf material, if we're thinking about that as a food source, is going to vary over the course of a season. So there's a peak point in the season when that actually is most valuable from a nutritional standpoint. And so on our farm, we've applied for some small grants to help do some forage quality tests, do some nutritional testing, so we can start to understand, because the research basically gives us information that that's true, that the nutritional quality changes over the season, but I can't tell you what month, in New York is the best time to harvest and feed black locust to our animals. And we're really interested in the varying quality over the course of the season. And then you have the other question, which is over the life cycle of the tree, what stage of growth are we keeping our material at? And there is some research to suggest that when an animal eats woody vegetation, eats that leafy material, that the regrowth actually has different nutritional characteristics than the sort of hardened off and older stuff. And And I would say generally the research suggests that, yeah, we want to stimulate new regrowth, just like we do in our pasture grasses with our trees. But we still have a lot of questions about the timing and the intensity of that, how much we let our animals graze those trees so that we can kind of optimize that. And that's where the fun, I think, begins.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. And one thing I'm thinking of is your optimum time to graze those woody species. It's probably not in the spring because you don't want to stunt the growth of the woody species. It's not going to be in the fall when the leaves are ready to fall off. So it's probably somewhere in the summer. And if you think about regions like you're in, if you're going to have a rainless period, a bit of, quote, drought, it's in the summer. Does the optimum time for those woody forages occur during that grassy drought period? I think there's a pretty good chance there's some overlap there.
Yeah, and we don't ever really graze our woody vegetation in the spring because what we actually have is the opposite problem, which is too much grass growing too quickly. So there's plenty for the animals to eat there. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think it's somewhere in that summer range. And so we're trying to kind of hone in on that a bit more, but that's certainly when we, just from our observational, we can see that the trees are, the leafy vegetation is sort of greenest and is peaking. And then we know that sometime in late summer, what trees do is start to senesce. And instead of putting on new growth, they're putting that growth back down into the roots. They're getting ready for winter at least in the temperate climate. And so, we can kind of pinpoint that. We're really interested in honing in so we understand. I hope even further that there's some variation within tree species so that we can start to think about staggering when we might feed different species to animals based on those kind of peak times. So a species around here that I'm really interested in is European buckthorn, which is considered an invasive species. It's not something we're going to plant or encourage, but it's in the landscape and it is a valuable fodder species. And what's interesting about it is it's also very high in condensed tannins, but it also tends to hold green leaves really late into the fall. So way past when the willow is sort of senesced and is yellow and is falling off, we see the buckthorn continuing to hold. So my hope is that long term we can see a nice distribution of these trees in the landscape that suggests how we might manage them, so we can kind of extend and expand our season as much as possible.
And this is a system you're actively using on your farm where you have a productive farm, livestock on it that you raise to sell. When you looked at your farm design, was it designed around a silvopasture system?
It was not, no. At that, when we started grazing, we were, I think, doing what a lot of people do is we stepped onto a new piece of land that we had purchased, and we were like, oh, there's a lot of grass here that we need to manage. So, I don't want to sit on the mower all summer, so let's get some animals to eat that grass. And then we kind of fell for sheep. We really liked. I'd managed cows and pigs and goats before, but hadn't tried sheep, and we really just liked working with them. And so I said, all right, let's really look at this as a thing we're going to do on this farm. And the trees, it was a side interest. I have a forestry background, so I was just always interested in trees. And we have a very windy site, so my first thought was, well, what we really need here are some trees to help with a windbreak because it can get really intense up here. But then that kind of evolved, and like I said, as recently as 2016 was when I realized that the trees were not just sort of a hobby side thing to think about, but really something essential if we wanted to have a climate resilient grazing system. And I feel like we kind of lucked out with, having enough of that kind of random woody vegetation to make it through that season. But that's when it really kicked into high gear for me to realize that this wasn't just a fun thing to explore on the side. It actually might be really essential to grazing successfully in the future. So it's I think every farm is going to have that evolution. And, I don't encourage anyone to say, well, I'm going to implement silvopasture over my 50 acres of grazing. I encourage folks to start small and, pick that edge or pick that little slice of the pasture that, again, is kind of most in need of repair and restoration, and maybe consider that as a place to kind of try some things out and see what works for you, because if anything, what I've seen is that, what works for one farm might suggest some ideas for another farm, but it's certainly not going to necessarily be the exact same solution for another site. So I think trees have a role in the landscape, but we have to question kind of each landscape, how that best plays itself out.
Yeah, for the marginalized land, if somebody's looking to give this a go, is the very zoomed out strategy of getting something established, lay out where your system would be on a design, do some rudimentary soil prep, put your species in, fence them out, irrigate if needed to keep them alive, and then eventually look to start foddering that out. Is it that simple?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm a huge fan of like Google Earth. It's like free software that we can start to measure and maybe lay out some rows and think about contour and do some initial planning. And we love having winter in our climate because that gives us time to actually do that. And then, yeah, as you kind of laid out there, we're thinking about soil tests. We're looking for deficiencies. We do want to do some soil prep and think about really the first 3 seasons of a tree's life are the most important. If it can get established and sort of rooted in, then we're kind of good to go and we can move on to other areas. So a question I always have for the farmer is, how many row feet of trees or how many trees do you feel like you can take care of for the first 3 seasons, whether that's thinking about, as you mentioned, irrigating or fencing or monitoring for any kind of issues that might come up, and set that as a goal for how much tree planting you're going to do each season. And then, the idea is, well, after a couple of years, I can kind of move my irrigation materials or I can move my attention to another spot and kind of let this evolve over time. So again, not starting with the whole farm, but thinking about the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and starting with those areas and then working your way out. And I really don't recommend that people just try to stick trees in pasture without, as you mentioned, kind of some soil prep. We do like to turn up the soil and kind of break up the sod layer and provide a nice loose soil for our new trees. And sometimes that works well in concert with other water management things we're doing on the farm. Like if we're doing swales, we create this berm that's basically a raised bed, which is ideal for a lot of tree species. Or we might use a rotary plow or something to just kind of rough up the soil. But, we do want to think about, some sort of weed barrier like mulching or some kind of easy thing to let those trees get a leg up. And again, after 2 or 3 years, we find that we can kind of back off our intensity and then move on to some other spot on the farm to plant more trees.
Do you have a rough estimate of cost per acre of somebody looking to do this? Is there anything you came across in your research or just from personal experience of some sort of ballpark to give people an idea of what they might be looking at financially? And or given your experience, is the NRCS supportive of this? Do you think there's grants available out there for it?
So it's a really that's a hard question because there's, of course, so many ifs, ands, and buts. The NRCS in New York, at least, recommends, they say it's around like $1,500 an acre is what they pay for people to plant trees. And that's actually at like 12 foot by 12 foot spacing. Like if you're going to put a forest back on an acre. So, if we take that as a starting point, if I'm looking to do 50% trees, then maybe I'm talking about half that over time. And that might include, suggestively, the trees themselves, the establishment, the tree tubes, if we need that, the kind of protection and maintenance to get them established. So I think that's a good starting point. Maybe is $750, $800 an acre might be reasonable. Now, if we propagate our own trees, again, with willow and poplar, we're basically talking about taking cuttings. With mulberry and black locust, if we're interested in those, we're talking about starting from seed. We can propagate thousands upon thousands of trees for for less than $100. And so your cost starts to plummet versus when you buy those seedlings for anywhere from $1 to $5 a tree. So that's a big part of the cost. And then as much as you have kind of a clear system for maintenance and how you kind of get that set up, you can really reduce your labor costs. So I think it's highly variable. I think that's a good estimate. And what we think about is ways that we can factor that cost into the enterprise budget that we have for our livestock. So reinvesting some of the surplus of that, of our sales of lamb every year into tree planting, because we know long-term that's an important thing. But we have gotten, it kind of depends state by state, but NRCS is very supportive of planting trees. It's not always that they have an interest. It really depends on the state and who your local contacts are, what their interest or awareness of silvopasture specifically is. So we have gotten some NRCS funding on our farm But a lot of that has been coming from the angle of planting trees for wildlife and pollinator habitat, which is not actually in conflict with our silvopasture goals, but that's the way it's framed so that we can get the funding. So it's important to have those conversations and realize that the goals of the NRCS are about land conservation, about environmental stewardship, and that actually works well with silvopasture. It's well aligned with some of these tree species as good pollinator foods, as good habitat, and good cover. But the way you sell it might not be as silvopasture, but as promoting those benefits, and that can really lead to some support financially, which is really, I think, important to get these systems up and rolling.
And some people might not have to go out and these species on their land. They might already have a system that they can use out there, be that marginalized or other. I've been on some farms that have had what I'll call like brush or kind of scrub brush, where there's, maybe a few established trees. It's definitely not forest. If you had acres of this and you created paddocks in that and subdivided it off, is that silvopasture? Or do you need an integration of a grassy pasture in to make sense? Can I manage brush and still be getting benefit like a silvopasture system?
I think you can immediately get benefit both from the fact that you're going to utilize more of the land that you have access to, and also the animals do benefit from, shade and shelter. I think if we want to be technical, we could call that a transitional silvopasture. I would say that the goal eventually is to thin out enough of that material so that enough light gets in so that we can establish those forages. And that would be like when we've hit silvopastures, when there's all three of those elements in the same space. And our farm, we have, again, we increased our grazing land by 20%, just incorporating these kind of scrubby, overgrown lands. But certainly we don't leave the animals in there as long as we would in our open pasture, because there's just not that much food available relative to what's out in the open field. So those are places that we do a lot of winter grazing in there with bale grazing. So we're encouraging the animals to trample things down and strip woody vegetation, which they go to quite heartily during the winter months, and help us open up the space. And now there's spaces, we've been doing that for a couple winters and they're ready to be seeded. They're ready to actually have that open enough canopy so that we can get those forage species established. So we like the kind of transitional approach where that's going to take us 3 or 4 years. And so we might think of that as transitional, but I kind of strictly define silvopasture as when all three of those elements are present. But we found benefit to that just even in the first year, because as we look at, we keep our animals essentially out on pasture all year round, and that woody, really overgrown stuff is actually really wonderful shelter for them during the winter months. And we've had some early lambings, some odd things happen, and we find them in those thickets, having their lambs and doing quite well and really carving themselves out. And I think that's a really good indicator of the benefit to them. So the challenge with silvopasture is, and with any perennial system is the reality is we're not looking at something that's going to be static year after year. It's going to change and be dynamic and shift. So we have to be cautious about that and think about what it's going to look like in year 1 versus 3 versus 5. And, we've thinned out some of these areas that are becoming silvopasture. Now we do have some more wind coming through, so some of the windbreak value of that unmanaged space is potentially being lost. Our goal is to offset that with the trees we're planting, but we're changing the ecosystem dynamics all the time. And, we have to recognize that the system's never going to look the same in the following year than it did in the previous year. And I enjoy that, but I think that's a thing we have to constantly be monitoring and thinking about.
A lot of people out there, land is a big barrier. They might not have a lot of open pasture because in a lot of parts of the country it is expensive, but they might have some woods on their property. How do you view opening up the woods or an established forest? I know you said, hey, start with the marginalized land. If you don't have a lot of that, what are your thoughts on thinning out something that's established? You come from a forestry background, the livestock perspective of things. When I say I want to go in and thin out the woods and almost take them from woods back to a silvopasture, you're kind of going backwards. How do you think about that?
So I think about that as certainly appropriate, but to be the sort of more mature and what we would call healthy the forest, the more caution we want to want to put into that activity. And one thing to think about is if you have X amount of acres, what's the top 25% in terms of like the best forest I have, and what's the middle 50%, and what's the low 25%, and maybe we aim to leave the top 25% of our woods alone, and again kind of start in the middle or start towards the lower end, and part of that's just the learning curve that exists. But I think it does come down to, and we see in the Northeast a lot is with land for some folks being scarce, they might go in and just completely clear woods 100% because they want to develop so-called pasture. So if that's what someone's up against, I'd rather them thin it out for silvopasture and leave some of the trees, because we know that the more trees that are left, the more sort of wider benefit that we have. So it depends on the scenario, and if someone's up against the wall and needs to really go at it with their land, then I think it's appropriate. But if you have the option to kind of think about that scale and where you could fall in, I think that's important. If it's old growth or really a legacy forest, I think we have to recognize that in the larger bioregion, that's a really ecologically important place. And so I'd really encourage that not to be a place to put livestock and not to open up. But the bad news / good news is that, most of our lands have been heavily managed by human presence. And most often they've been cleared in relatively recent history. So we don't tend to have land that has that long-term legacy. And I think there's most cases where we could make that justification to thin. What I'd recommend for folks is that they work with, a local forester. Many states have free services to help do that assessment and have some good conversations. And just know that, when you start to make decisions about forests, we're talking about lifetimes or generational type decisions, because those consequences we don't probably even experience in our own lifetime. We might see them several generations down the road. So we want to be very deliberate and bring in lots of different perspectives as we deliberate about how we're going to proceed.
When you think about establishing a system like this on your farm, do you approach it differently based upon what ruminant you have? If you're somebody who just does cattle, you're never going to do sheep, you're never going to do goats. Either you don't have the market, you're not interested in them. Do you look at designing the system different, whether that's converting marginal land over to silvopasture or planting tree species into existing pasture, say if I only go on cattle?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I mentioned before was, if we're going to plant trees, our row spacing is very different because we want to be creating really good paddocks for animals. So, smaller animals, maybe 50-ish feet is a good starting point between, spacing between rows. Versus cattle, I've been on farms where it seems like 80 or 100 feet's better. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is that, our sheep can kind of weave in and out. Like we have some willow plantings that we have, and they can kind of interact with them and gnaw a little bit here and a little bit there and kind of work through. But the cattle could very much just kind of plow through. And so one conversation that's happening in the silvopasture world is the idea of fodder blocks, which is if you want to feed especially larger grazing animals fodder, that you give them access to an area that you've actually planted very densely for a very short amount of time, and then you move them out of there. So we have to think about with larger animals, we have the weight and sort of the bulk of these animals that could really wreak havoc. And so, it might change the arrangement. I might only have my fodder species or my tree species on the edges of paddocks, and they may not ever really interact with them in the same way, because it takes, a locust can grow in 3 or 4 seasons. It can be hardened off enough for a goat or a sheep potentially, but for a cow, it might take 10 or 15 years because the trunk has to be established enough. So maybe we think about our design as less trees right in the pasture, but more on the edges or something like that. So there's definitely different considerations. We don't have good research about the specifics of that. But again, we can kind of go with some of those generalizations based on the behavior of the animals, the size and the bulk, and how they might interact with the space. So, I think that what I hear as feedback is that the smaller ruminants are like the most, silvopasture ready, as are poultry. But pigs and cows in particular, depending on our system, we have to exercise a bit more caution and know that there's going to be some different parameters as we design our silvopastures.
It's a really interesting subject that I think has a lot to offer this space. Your book is a great starting point, I think, for a lot of people. Silvopasture, a guide to managing grazing animals. And I'd highly recommend for people to check that out. Beyond your book, what are some other good resources that are out there for people who want to learn more about this?
Yeah, so we have, if folks visit our website, which is silvopasturebook.com, we really want to make as much material, easily accessible to folks as possible. So there is a resources page on there where we've provided links to a lot of university and extension material. It's really high value. There's, universities specifically that are doing good silvopasture research. So like if you're down in the Southeast, for instance, Tuskegee University is doing a lot of research and extensions with southern species and systems that really are adapted to southeastern U.S., for instance. So there's, it's good to seek out those resources that are geographically really relevant. We are doing an online course in 2019, so we'll do a 6-week course that kind of walks folks through the book, and it's going to be very design focused in that we're hoping to help people kind of work through and propose ways they might design silvopasture, again, using like Google Earth as simple design tools to do that. And there's a really burgeoning kind of, I always say start with the grass-fed folks. There's a lot of people getting into grass-fed livestock management, and that's actually the starting point. So silvopasture is something to incorporate into your grazing system after you've, or in concert with really understanding rotational grazing and grass-fed based systems. So I've actually encouraged people to slow down before when I see that they need to work more in that avenue and then add silvopasture, because it's another layer of complexity. And so any of the great resources around that, I think, are things that folks should think about. And I really recommend, in addition to our book, that folks check out Sarah Flack's book, The Art and Science of Grazing, because that really provides that foundation that we need to think about before we add the trees in or before we bring animals into the woods.
People can check out her book. They can check out your book, the online course, if people are interested in that. When is it? Where can they find out more on that?
Yes, you can visit, again, silvopasturebook.com has the information on that. We're going to start that course on March 7th. There's going to be live webinars on Thursday evenings. Those will be recorded, so if you can't make it, you can listen to those later. There'll be a whole bunch of resources in there, and then sort of some support as you work through your design. So you can find out more about that at our book website.
There you have it, farmer and author Steve Gabriel, author of the book Silvopasture. If you want to check out Steve's book, be sure to check it out at the link below or search for Silvopasture anywhere where you can find books these days. Also, you can click on the link below to find out more information on Steve's upcoming course. I really want to thank Steve for coming on today, taking some time to share his information with you. If you enjoyed this episode, maybe we'll have Steve back on again in the future for a more advanced episode. And it's likely that episode in the future would be brought to you by the Grassfed Life Insider. So if you enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more from Steve, then consider becoming a Grassfed Life Insider. By becoming an insider for just $5 a month, you help us produce content just like this. If you want more advanced content from Steve, well, then I'm most likely going to have to pay him to produce that content. That's where you come in. Your membership helps us create the free content like you heard today and more advanced paid content like you might hear sometime in the future. To learn more about becoming an insider, visit grassfedlife.co/insider. That's all for this one. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.